You're listening to Midian, a Kilenya Romance by Andrea Pearson. Copyright 2015, Andrea Pearson. Dedication. To my daughter. For your gentle, shy and sweet personality. For your example to me. I love you. Midian dropped to the bank of the stream near the castle and pulled off her slippers, plunging her hot feet in the cool water. As was usually the case, her casual stroll through the forest had turned into much more, and several hours had flown by. She leaned back, enjoying the slight breeze and the warmth of the sunlight that filtered through the leaves to her face. It was such a beautiful spring afternoon. She stretched out her toes, letting water rush between them, and vowed that next time she wouldn't go so far. Midian chuckled. Such vows never held when she was confronted with the beauty of the land surrounding Gevkan Castle. Even though she'd lived there her entire life, nearly 25 years now, she never tired of the forests and gardens. The sound of horse hooves clacking on the nearby cobblestone road interrupted the stillness of the afternoon, and Midian jerked to a sitting position. Prince Dmitri must be arriving. Lest anyone see her with her shoes off, she pulled her feet out of the water and shook them, trying to get them dry. Oh, how happy the princess would be. Their long wait was nearly over. Arian and the prince had been courting in secret for almost 7 years. 7 long years. 7 very, very long years. Midian had stayed at Arian's side, helping her cope with the loneliness, laughing with her at the jokes Dmitri put in his letters, and sighing at the sweet and tender promises he made. Dmitri would probably be embarrassed to know that Arian had shared with Midian every single word he wrote. Slippers back on her feet, Midian dashed through the trees toward the castle. She could have sent a Minya to deliver the message, but she wanted to see the expression on Arian's face herself. She paused, peered around a corner of the wall, and watched as 2 men on horses passed beneath the large arch and stopped near the stables. One dismounted and handed the reins to the other. Midian squinted, trying to see his face. It was Dmitri. She spun, racing toward the servants' entrance. Just before opening the door, she glanced both ways. Father would be annoyed if he knew she still entered the castle this way. But no one was watching. She flung the door open and tore down the corridor, stopping beside a suit of armor. Again, verifying that no one watched, she squeezed behind the armor and snuck down a damp, dark passageway, a grin on her face. It would take Dmitri at least 10 minutes to introduce himself to the butler, and for the butler to send someone to alert Arian of the prince's arrival. Midian would reach Arian in a third of that time. Knowing she wouldn't come across any servants here, she ran full out down the tight corridor, careful not to get her dress dirty from the damp walls. It only took her a few minutes to reach the 3rd floor and the room she and Arian had shared since childhood. Midian knocked, then stepped inside, shutting the door quietly behind her. Arian? Are you here? Yes. Midian stepped into the sitting room just off the main quarters. She plopped onto the couch next to the princess. I have news for you. Arian dropped the book she was reading into her lap and glanced at Midian. You're out of breath. Did you run all the way? She bent, looking at Midian's shoes. And through the forest, apparently. Midian nodded. Arian chuckled. Why, you could have had Slana deliver the message. She's been bored all afternoon. Midian glanced at Slana, Arian's Minya. The small, wingless creature, only a couple of inches tall, floated in the air by the window. I didn't want to bother her. She leaned forward, hand on Arian's arm. I had to be here when you heard. Arian's eyes lit up. You said you have news. It has to be good news, right? She gasped, straightening, dropping her feet to the floor from where they'd been curled beneath her. Is it my fiancé? Has he finally come? No, it's better than that. Midian jumped up. Prince Dmitri just arrived. Oh, you! Arian threw the book at Midian, and Midian laughed, dodging it. She bent, picked up the book, dropped it on the couch, then grabbed Arian's hand. Come on, let's make sure you're ready for your prince. Arian's hand shook under Midian's touch. Do I look okay? How is my hair? My dress? She patted her cheek with her free hand. Is he really here? Midian laughed. You've been wearing your finest dresses all week. Your hair is beautiful. And yes, he's here. Huh? She paused, inspecting Arian's face. But your makeup needs some work. Have you been rubbing your eyes again? Arian glanced down. Of course. I can't get used to that earth stuff Aldo brought. It's called mascara, and you don't need to wear it if you don't want to. Midian led Arian to the water basin and mirror. But you can't go meet Dmitri with black smeared under your eyes. She helped Arian remove the smudges, then tucked a loose strand of auburn hair back into her elegant style. Oh, how I wish I had your hair, Midian said with a sigh. Arian rolled her eyes. Stop saying that. Yours is beautiful. Midian raised her eyebrows. Everyone has brown hair. No one has your hair. Father did when he was younger, I replied. Someone knocked on the door and the friends turned, smiling at each other. Enter, Arian called. The door opened and a young maid stepped across the threshold. Prince Dmitri has arrived, she said. He waits in the front library. She curtsied and left. Arian squealed. She only waited a couple of seconds before sprinting across the room and flinging the door open. Midian followed more slowly, smiling at her friend's exuberance. The excitement was to be expected. Arian had waited so long for Dmitri to finish his duties and come to her. Truzenal, the neighbouring kingdom where Dmitri was from, had been slowly destroying itself. The people were evil. Their king was evil, and for a time, Dmitri had followed in his father's footsteps. But upon meeting Arian, he changed his life. Midian knew from his letters that other events had helped him mature and grow, especially the death of his mother, practically at the hands of his father, but Midian was positive that Arian's sweet personality had been instrumental. Luckily, Gevkin, the land Arian's father ruled, was much more stable. Dmitri and Arian would be able to start their new life together without worry or fear of retribution from Dmitri's father. Gevkin's army was large, strong, and well-trained. Midian trailed Arian to the main floor and watched as her friend rushed into the library. She counted to 20 before entering, knowing they needed privacy. Dmitri had lowered his hood. He gazed down at Arian with a relaxed face and adoration in his eyes. Arian glowed, gazing up at him, arms around his shoulders. Midian walked around, straightening the chairs that lined the room, trying not to watch them but unable to resist. Dmitri tucked that wayward strand back behind Arian's ear. Midian put a hand to the necklace at her throat and held it tightly. How would it be to have a man show her such love? She swallowed past the pain that had risen from her chest. In no way did she begrudge Arian her circumstances, but she wished she were in a similar situation. 25 years meant that she was bordering on spinsterhood. Her mother hadn't married until 35, so she knew there was still hope. She sighed. If only things would happen soon. King Roylance's head butler approached Dmitri and waited patiently for the prince to turn his attention from his future bride. Midian snickered. The lovebirds didn't even notice the man. He finally cleared his throat. Loudly. Dmitri startled. What? Yes? What is it? Your stable boy has secured the horses. He'll join you shortly. The expression of disdain on the butler's face made it apparent how he felt about a stable boy joining the prince, and Midian had to agree. Dmitri tilted his head. Stable boy? He raised his eyebrows, his mouth opening. Oh, you mean Kelson? He's not a stable boy. He's my best friend. He turned back to Aryan. You'll enjoy his company a great deal. The man can get me to laugh for hours. Aryan tucked her arm through Dmitri's. The only attention I want is yours. Tell me of your journey. The two walked out of the ballroom, and Midian followed at a distance. She didn't want to eavesdrop, but until Aryan realized she was there, she didn't know what else to do. Her eyes lit up as she remembered the painting she'd just started. She'd go work on that. Midian turned to leave, but instead ran into a broad chest and wide set of shoulders. Excuse me, a man said, laughing. He stepped around her, removing his cloak as he walked. Kelson, Dmitri said, stopping. Glad you caught up. His entire face radiated joy as he turned Aryan toward his friend. This is Aryan, my princess. Aryan curtsied and Kelson bowed, but Midian barely noticed the exchange. Her eyes refused to leave Kelson's head. His hair. It was yellow. How was that possible? He glowed. Dmitri looked down at Aryan, grinning. She was about to show me to my new quarters. Aryan placed a hand on Dmitri's chest. You're serious? You're here to stay? Dmitri nodded. I don't ever plan to return to my father's castle. Oh, Dmitri, that's wonderful. Aryan threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. Kelson laughed, a pleasant sound that came from deep in his chest. You were right. She's perfectly happy about how your father hates you and wishes you'd never been born. Wanting to get a better look at this man, Midian stepped cautiously to the side of the hall and approached Aryan, pretending not to be listening to their conversation. Dmitri and Kelson laughed about something they'd seen along the way, and the princess was so involved in what they were saying, she didn't notice her friend. Midian was given the perfect opportunity to examine the new person. She paused near a table and rested her hand on it. The golden hair wasn't his only unusual attribute. His eyes were bright blue, his skin light. So light. And he had little brown spots on his face. Freckles, Uncle Aldo called them. She'd never seen anyone so beautiful. The prince laughed. Didn't I tell you, Kelson, things will work out just fine. Dmitri put his arm around his best friend. And there's plenty of room here in the castle. Right, Aryan? He looked at his fiancée. She smiled. Of course. He'll stay as well. Kelson clapped Dmitri on the shoulder. The hospitality here definitely beats what we had in Truzenel, eh? The two friends and Aryan continued down the hall. Midian started forward and nearly fell over the table. She scooted around it, keeping one hand on the surface until she'd passed, ensuring another bump didn't happen. The three adults entered a sitting room, and Midian, still not sure whether she would be welcome to join them, hovered just out of sight in the hall. Should she go in? Introduce herself? Her breath shortened, and her head felt light. No, she couldn't do that. What was the matter with her? She wasn't really this shy, was she? Kelson was so different. She bit her lip, realizing that for the first time she was truly self-conscious. It wasn't often that she ran into strangers. She knew pretty much everyone who worked in the castle or lived in Mayviral, the nearest city. Was she shy? At her age, she should know her character already. Again, she had to wonder what was the matter with her. Midian peeked around the corner at Kelson. The lighting wasn't bright enough, and she pulled back, disappointed that his hair wasn't glowing. He laughed, and she found herself smiling, wishing she could join their conversation, but still afraid to do so. It wasn't that Aryan was being rude. Definitely not. Midian wasn't upset or hurt that her friend hadn't remembered to make introductions. Ariane hadn't seen Dmitri in 2 years. It was no wonder he was all she could think about now. Dmitri had only met Midian twice, and Kelson didn't know a thing about her. "How did the last meeting with your followers go?" Ariane asked during a lull in the conversation. "I know you were worried about it." "It was interrupted," Dmitri said. "My father somehow found out." He paused, an expression of sadness on his face. "Many died at the hands of my brothers and their soldiers. Pretty much the rest of our supporters," Kelson said. Ariane gasped. "That's so awful." Midian agreed, wishing she could be there to show her sympathy. And the longer she waited to go into the room, the more upset Ariane would be with herself for having forgotten. Midian looked around the corner again, grateful that they sat away from the door. She slipped inside and took a seat near the door where they wouldn't notice her right away. Thank goodness there were books on the shelf next to her. She'd have something to do. At least, something to pretend to be doing. She glanced over. Dmitri held his head in his hands. "The people have fallen," his voice caught. "There wasn't anything more I could do." Kelson's eyes didn't leave the floor. Ariane placed her hand on Dmitri's back. "I know it will, but..." No one said anything for a moment. "Can I help in some way?" Ariane asked. Kelson shook his head. "No, they won't accept anything that looks like charity. It doesn't matter who delivers it." He said it quietly, as if defeated. The pain on his face touched Midian's heart. He really cared for those people. She sighed, a sudden urge to smooth away his worry lines nearly overcoming her. As if sensing her attention, Kelson looked over. Midian startled and raised her book. Oh dear. Oh dear. She'd been caught staring at him. Why couldn't she have been more discreet? She bit her lip, not seeing the words that blended together in front of her. Kelson jumped out of his chair, peering around Midian's book. "Who's this?" Dmitri laughed. Midian, Ariane's best friend. Ariane stood where Midian's book didn't block her. "Have you been here the entire time? Put that away and come join us, Mid." Her eyes twinkled. Midian shook her head and swallowed several times. She recognized Ariane's expression. This wouldn't be pretty. Ariane grabbed Midian's arm, pulling her to her feet. "Ariane, I'm fine," Midian said, trying to shrug away. "Nonsense." Ariane ignored Midian's protests and dragged her over to where the men sat. Whether Midian liked it or not, she was about to be thrust into the spotlight. How she wished she'd gone upstairs to finish her painting. Kelson took one of her hands. "I haven't seen such beauty in years." He kissed her palm. Tingles raced up her arm, making her nearly shiver. No man had ever kissed her hand that way, and it made her feel good. Pretty. He grinned at her mischievously. "What was your name again?" Midian looked at the floor, feeling a blush cross her cheeks. Traitor's red. It always told the truth. "Midian," she said, scuffing her slippers together under her dress. She stopped immediately when she realized what she was doing. What was that? He still hadn't released her. "Midian," Ariane said. "And Dmitri's right. She's my best friend." "Is she a cousin, a distant relative?" Kelson stared at Midian, making her feel like her heart had stopped beating. She tried to ignore the dryness in her mouth. "She doesn't look a thing like you. Her hair is too dark." "No, her father is Ezra, one of my father's advisors. We grew up together." Midian pulled away from Kelson and grabbed her necklace, holding it against herself, not knowing what else to do with her now empty hand. Kelson laughed, motioning to her hand. "I'll be sure to borrow that again in the future." He winked. Did he really just do that? Her jaw dropped, and she stepped backward. What made him think she'd let him repeat the action? He chuckled, then did the most outrageous thing she'd ever seen a man do. He puckered his lips at her. Her jaw dropped. How juvenile could an adult be? Did he expect her to like that? To appreciate or find humor in it? And to think she'd enjoyed the feel of his lips on her palm. Her chest tightened, and a burning sensation swept up the back of her neck and across her cheeks as she thought of her physical reaction earlier to this disgusting man. Knowing her face was probably redder than a beet, she struggled, trying to remain calm. To control her embarrassment and anger, to keep from smacking that ridiculous, stupid smile off his face. Obviously sensing her frustration, Kelson laughed again. Oh, she clenched her fists, then strode from the room, her back straight. Kelson's laughter followed her. The next day, Midian spent as much time as possible in her room. She fumed inwardly, rejecting every offer Arian or Dmitri made for her to join them. Kelson was unpredictable, a show-off, a loudmouth, practically an idiot. She couldn't believe she'd ever found him attractive. When supper was announced, she knew she had no choice but to attend, as King Roylance had asked everyone to be present. She vowed the entire way to the dining room that she wouldn't pay any attention to Kelson, she wouldn't look at him, and she definitely wouldn't admire his golden hair. Hopefully he'd sit somewhere the sun didn't reach. Midian entered the dining room and glanced around, relieved to see that Kelson and Dmitri hadn't arrived yet. She chose a seat next to Midian and unfolded her napkin in her lap, keeping her eyes on her hands when the men came soon after. Of course, Kelson chose the seat across from her. Luckily, Aldo and Ezra sat on her other side. Ezra was her father, and Aldo was his twin brother. Though they didn't speak with her during the meal, father rarely turned his attention to anyone but Aldo and the king. They at least made her feel more protected from Kelson and his immature ways. But Kelson surprised her by not talking to her at all. She even began to relax when chicken was served as the main course. She loved chicken. King Roylance put down his fork halfway through dinner. I'm pleased and excited to announce that Prince Dmitri and his guest, Kelson, will be staying here indefinitely. Dmitri and Kelson grinned, and Arian, Aldo, and father clapped. Midian refused to acknowledge the news. She accidentally glanced across the table, only to feel a flush cross her cheeks when Kelson met her eyes. She looked away. We would have loved to have thrown a large dinner party to welcome our new friends, but things aren't as good as they could be. A line appeared between the king's eyebrows. Queen Aralise is still sick, worse today than yesterday, and I'll be spending as much time with her as possible. Midian shook her head. Poor Queen Aralise. She'd been so ill lately. The king straightened, wrists on the edge of the table. Also, we're expecting visitors. Ramantus isn't likely to let his favourite son go so easily. As a precaution, I'd appreciate it if none of you left the castle. You're adults and free to choose as you will, but please take my request into consideration. You run your kingdom so differently from how my father runs his, Dmitri said, shaking his head. Would that my father were so gracious. King Roylance smiled kindly. It's why I have such loyal subjects. Dmitri leaned forward, an earnest expression on his face. I'd like to learn everything about how you lead and rule. Everything. As you know, I didn't have much of a role model. The king nodded. We'll have plenty of time for that, I give you my word. Especially since you'll be taking my place. I'll teach you as much as I can. He took a deep breath and released it slowly. For now, Kelson and Dmitri, you'll be entertained by Arian and Midian. I must take care of the queen. Kelson smiled broadly at Midian, and father elbowed her in the side. She sank into her chair, wishing it would swallow her up. Wait, Ariane said. "Dmitri, didn't you say your father wouldn't be following you?" "Yes," Dmitri said, "but if the king has heard otherwise." Everyone looked at King Roylance. Eyes have seen preparations at Treachery Castle. It looks like Romantis is planning a trip. And my Minia overheard him say he was going to force you to return. "This is ridiculous," Dmitri said. "He knows where I stand." "Yes, well, he isn't known for being diplomatic, is he?" Dmitri snorted. "Not at all." Everyone resumed eating, but Midian noticed that Kelson looked confused. She resisted the urge to watch him. Why did she still find his features so interesting? Finally, he cleared his throat. "What is a minya?" Midian raised her eyebrow. How could he not know? King Roylance set down his silverware. "A flying messenger about this tall." He held his thumb and index finger 2 inches apart. "They pass information quickly from one person to another and use their magic to fly without wings." He frowned. "You've never heard of them before?" Kelson shook his head. Dmitri took a drink. "Father outlawed minyas many years ago, long before Kelson was born." He raised his hand and whispered loudly behind it to Ariane. "Kelson's a young one." Kelson rolled his eyes. "Yeah, really young. You're only older than me by 3 months. King Roylance cleared his throat, and all eyes returned to him. "Back to what I brought up earlier. You heard me correctly, right, Ariane?" "Which part, Father?" "I would rather you not leave the castle, not even to go to the stables or the city." She nodded. "Of course." The king pushed away from the table. "If you get bored, you can always visit me in the library." Ariane laughed. "Hopefully we won't get that bored." Midian was surprised to see the excitement, followed by disappointment, on Kelson's face at what the king had said. Why? Was he interested in seeing the library? He met her gaze again, and she dropped her eyes, refusing to interact with him even a little. Midian plopped onto her bed, then reached over and pulled the curtains back so she could see Ariane. She knew they were probably too old to be sharing a room still, but they'd never had a reason to stop, knowing it would end when one of them got married anyway. "Speaking of which, have you and Dmitri chosen a date for the wedding?" Ariane shook her head and picked up a brush. "We're hoping for sometime in November." Midian rolled to her side. 6 months away. That should be plenty of time to prepare." "Yes, that's what we were thinking." Ariane tied back her hair, then jumped on top of her large bed and flopped onto her stomach, chin resting in her hands, feet in the air. "Tell me what you think of Kelson. I saw you watching him at supper." Midian's eyes went heavenward. This was the last thing she wanted to talk about. She decided to go the innocent route. "What do you mean?" "He's not bad looking. A little too blonde for my taste." Midian scoffed. "Too blonde? I think his hair is perfect." Ariane laughed. "Yes, I figured you would." "I can't help it. If Gevkin had people with that shade of hair and those blue eyes, he wouldn't be so..." She stopped. "So shiny to me." "I've got blue eyes." Midian raised an eyebrow. "Yes, but I'm not going to spend my time gazing into them, thank you very much. I can tell you're still mad at him. Are you ever going to talk to him again?" "Maybe." She sat up. "You saw what he did. You would have slapped him for behaving that way toward you." She flung her thick dark braid over one shoulder. "And besides, I doubt he'd ever let me get a word in." Ariane snorted. "He always does seem to have something to say, doesn't he? Can't tell if he's joking or being serious." Midian scowled. "Kissing my palm, then doing that with his lips. Dmitri used to be that way. The always joking around part, when I first met him. But there are too many things for him to worry over now." She knitted her eyebrows. Kelson has been with him for many of his trials. They sure have handled it differently. Dmitri is more serious now, and Kelson jokes around a lot more. Midian lay back on the bed and grabbed her pillow, holding it to her chest. Why did you never meet Kelson before, if he's Dmitri's best friend? Dmitri always made sure to bring someone different with him when we got together. Always someone from his group of followers. I think he didn't want to get Kelson in trouble if he was ever followed. Midian nodded. That makes sense. They were silent for a while. When it seemed like Ariane didn't want to talk anymore, Midian got up and pulled the covers down. She was about to draw the curtains around her bed when Ariane spoke again. I'm serious, by the way, about talking to Kelson. He might end up thinking you hate him if you never do. Midian smiled. I get the feeling having a woman dislike him would be just what he needs. She reached over and pulled her drapes shut. I'm too tired to think about it right now. I'll deal with him in the morning. Midian didn't get a chance to deal with Kelson. Apparently, he wasn't a morning person. He actually stayed quiet during the entire breakfast meal. Midian found herself relaxing in his presence for the first time, and most of the day he didn't pick on her or even really address her. The four played games, ate lunch, played more games, ate supper, then went back to the game room again. The sun was just setting when Kelson dropped his cue stick. I can't take this anymore. I'm so bored I think I'd rather pull my hairs out one at a time. Midian nodded with everyone else. He was right. They were all getting testy and frustrated with being stuck indoors all day. Kelson slumped in a chair next to Midian and grinned at her. She bit the inside of her cheek, unsure how to react to his close proximity. She was supposed to be mad at him still. After all, he'd really upset and frustrated her the day before. But today, he'd been nice and normal, and he'd even acted like he'd been taught proper manners. She took a deep breath, her mind automatically turning to food to help decrease the boredom. We could grab a snack from the kitchen. That's a great idea, Kelson said, jumping to his feet. Dmitri snorted. Right. No, I'm serious, Kelson said. Let's break in, and we'll go a back way, through the secret corridors. We can pretend we're on a raid of infinite importance. Ariane raised an eyebrow. Are we children again? Besides, it wouldn't be breaking in. Kelson held up his hand. I'm decided on this. No more talk of reason. Midian couldn't help the smile that crossed her face. For once, his excitement was infectious, rather than annoying. Unfortunately, Kelson noticed her smile. He pointed at her. Ah, she thinks I'm funny. Did you see that? She smiled. I swear, she only smiles once a day. He bounded into the seat next to her again. Smile for me. Please. He gave her a cheeky grin, and she rolled her eyes and looked away. Why did he insist on being so childish all the time? Why punish and torture her? Why had he singled her out to be the object of his jokes? Ariane grabbed Kelson by the arm and tugged on him. Fine, we'll go on your raid. But leave poor Mid alone. All right. He jumped out of his seat with enough enthusiasm to shame a joker, then motioned to Ariane. Show the way to the nearest secret tunnel. She shook her head. Actually, Mid is the one who knows this place best. Even better. Midian sent a long look at Ariane, the traitor. She glanced at Kelson. You might be too large to get through some of the passageways. Hey, I'm not that fat, am I? Kelson turned to the side, putting his hands on his hips and sucking in his stomach. What existed of it, anyway? Giving Midian a great view of his profile. She frowned. That's not what I meant. I get it. You don't like me because I'm not as stick-thin as Dmitri. Midian's scowl deepened. What was with Kelson? We'll need flashlights. No response? Wow. Harsh. Okay, Kelson, knock it off. Dmitri said, joining them. "What are flashlights?" "Something Uncle Aldo brought back while travelling. They're sources of light that don't require fire." Kelson's face lit up. "Excellent. The nearest supply wardrobe should have enough for all of us." Midian led the way to the wardrobe. She pulled the door open, careful not to let the men see what was inside. Aldo would be okay with them using the flashlights, but some of the other stuff in there would be off-limits. And, knowing Kelson's personality, he'd never be able to keep his hands off the things. She grabbed 4 sticks. 3 were olive green and 1 was mustard yellow. Such ugly colours. Aldo had insisted they were the only ones available at the place where he'd gotten them. She instructed the men on how to use the flashlights and was promptly blinded by Kelson. Not surprising. She turned away and shut the wardrobe door. "Show the way, madam," Kelson said. Midian entered a long hallway lined with tapestries. Instead of turning right at the next junction, thereby going straight to the kitchen, she went left, jogged down some stairs, then paused at a table covered with all sorts of candle holders. She tipped one forward. A large panel of wood to the side of the table slid open, revealing a dark, gaping corridor. "Whoa," Kelson said. "Can I take the lead? We might get lost, but that'd be even more fun." Midian motioned for him to go ahead, shaking her head at him. Kelson switched on his flashlight and bounded into the small hallway, completely filling it with his large frame. Dmitri and Arian followed, and Midian brought up the rear, shutting the panel behind them. She flicked on her light. She inhaled deeply, held it, then exhaled, focusing on letting the tension in her shoulders dissipate. With Kelson ahead of her, she no longer felt like someone was constantly watching her. Kelson crept forward. Every time he reached a door, he pressed his ear against it, shushing the others. A couple of times, he opened the door a fraction of an inch and peeked through, then closed it and continued onward. When they encountered junctions in the corridor, he'd peer left, then right, and nearly always went left. Every now and then, he asked Midian which direction they were facing. That was all the help he wanted. Kelson chose to go right at the next crossroads, and they'd been walking down that hallway for only a few paces when Midian heard a sound behind her. She spun, the light of her beam flickering off a pair of eyes at the end of the hall. Human? She couldn't tell. If it was, the person was kneeling. The eyes were low, only a few feet from the floor. They disappeared, and more sounds followed as whatever it was scrambled around a corner and out of sight. "Kelson," she hissed. "Stop." The others turned. "There is something in the hall behind us." Midian narrowed her eyes. She'd spent hours and hours down here since she was little, and she couldn't remember ever running into anyone in this part of the castle. "Let's go check it out," Kelson whispered. He squeezed past Midian and, reversing their path, took the lead again, walking as silently as he could. If Midian hadn't been nervous, she would have laughed. He looked very silly, exaggerating his tiptoeing and hunching over. They reached the turn, and Kelson jumped into the opening, shining his light down the hall. "Gotcha!" he yelled. Midian caught up with him and peered around the corner in time to see a werbie. A 3-foot-tall, fairly innocent creature running the other way. "It's just a werbie. They're friendly. I don't think there's... Wait a moment. Werbies aren't allowed here." "Let's get him," Kelson said. He and Dmitri sprinted forward, chasing after the creature as fast as possible. Arian and Midian hurried to keep up. Why would a werbie be sneaking through the secret halls of Gevkan Castle? The unintelligent creatures were mainly used for manual labour. Midian's hair started tumbling down, and she struggled to keep it away from her face. The werbie was surprisingly fast, but it didn't seem like this one knew where to go, however, because not long after they started chasing it, They cornered it. "Whoa," Kelson said, stopping abruptly. "What's wrong with it?" He jumped backward. "Stop that!" Midian pushed past Ariane and gasped. A Werby's single magical power was the ability to change its hands into whatever it needed, and this one's had turned into knives. It was trying to attack Kelson. "That isn't a Werby." Dmitri looked back at Ariane. "Its eyes aren't blue, it's a dust." Midian covered her mouth. He was right. The creature's eyes were dark brown. "How did it get into the castle?" Ariane asked. Worry etched on her face. Dmitri shook his head. "Don't know. But we have to take care of it." "No, touch me!" the dust yelled when Kelson suddenly jumped forward. "I'll touch you all right." "You're not supposed to be here." Dmitri joined the scrimmage, and quickly the two men wrestled the dust to the floor. In large numbers and when trained well, dusts could be formidable against a group like this. But just one of them? They were easy to overpower. "What do we do with it?" Kelson asked. "Ouch!" He flung his arm back, barely maintaining his hold on the dust, when the thing changed its hand into what looked like a porcupine's back. "Take it to the dungeons, then let my father know," Ariane said. She turned to Midian. "Is there a fast way from here?" Midian nodded. "Yes, but the little beast will be easier to control with them pressing it to the floor like that. Otherwise, it'll escape far too easily." "Okay." Ariane turned to Dmitri and Kelson. "Keep it here. We'll go get help." Midian turned and ran, Ariane on her tail. 10 minutes later, Midian and Ariane arrived at the dungeon, hot, sweaty, and out of breath. Between gasps, Ariane explained the situation to the jailer. He found an appropriate cell for the creature, then gathered several other guards to help retrieve the dust. It took an hour to get the creature into the cell. Once it was locked up, Midian, Kelson, Ariane, and Dmitri surveyed it. Dmitri fingered a large scratch on his chin. "With hands like those, how do you keep it contained? Couldn't the dust get out of pretty much any situation?" Midian raised her eyebrows. Shouldn't Dmitri already know the answer to that question? "Oh," Ariane pointed to a pile of junk in the corner of the cell. "Toys. The jailer will replace them frequently, and they'll keep the dust preoccupied. We've done it before. Any time the creatures start thinking about escaping, they get distracted with the contraptions." Dmitri nodded. "Interesting." Kelson rubbed his face. "I'm so confused." He pointed at Midian. "You called it a Werby." He pointed at Dmitri. "Then you called it a dust. And the only difference is the eyes." "Yes," Dmitri said. "Werby's eyes are blue and dust's are brown." Kelson stared blankly at Dmitri. "That's weird." "It's because dusts always choose to follow evil people, and Werby's are more loyal to those who are good." Kelson had obviously grown tired of or bored with the conversation. "Well, that doesn't answer my question, but I'm still hungry." He turned to Midian. "Let's go straight to the kitchen after talking to the king. No more detours." "That's just fine with me." She turned and led the way back upstairs, where Aldo found them. "There you are." He put his hand on Midian's shoulder. "I've been looking everywhere. I heard you found a dust." "Yes, in one of the passageways." He glowered, folding his arms. "How in heaven's name did it get there?" She shrugged. "We don't know, but it's in the dungeon now. We need to tell King Roylance." "Let me handle that later. He's with the Queen now. In the meantime, don't wander around anymore. Stay in the main areas of the castle." Kelson put his hand on Midian's arm. Her skin tingled under his touch, but she refused to allow the contact to control her emotions. She wasn't supposed to enjoy that anymore. It was Midian's idea to wander the hidden corridors of the castle, if you can believe that. Her mouth popped open, her face burning when Kelson laughed. Aldo raised a bushy eyebrow. Somehow I doubt my niece came up with the plan. Kelson hit his thigh, laughing even harder. I know, but look at her expression. Aldo didn't seem to think it was funny, and Midian decided not to wait to see what anyone else said. She excused herself and stalked off toward the kitchen. How could someone be so rude? She wanted to punch him so badly. Aryan caught up to her in the kitchen. I'm sorry about him. Dmitri says he's a flirt and a show-off. It doesn't matter. I'm tired of being humiliated. He's doing it because he's interested in you. No, he's doing it because he wants attention. If he actually liked me, he'd stop acting like a teenager and would behave like the grown man he is. Aryan, he's at least 25, not 15. 26, and yes, I know. Aryan sighed. They'll be coming in a minute. Hurry, get what you want. Then we can sit alone and let the men eat together. Midian nodded. She got busy and pretended not to notice when Kelson, Dmitri and Aldo entered. But Kelson didn't let her have her peace. Almost immediately, he singled her out yet again. Hey, Midian! Aldo says he's got a study full of interesting things. He's going to take us to see it after we eat. Come with us. She didn't look at him, focusing instead on putting together a sandwich. She was afraid that if she responded, she'd seriously regret what she said. After she finished making her sandwich, she turned and walked to where Aryan already sat with a bowl of warmed-up soup. To her surprise, Kelson didn't pursue the conversation. What a relief. He, Aldo and Dmitri sat by themselves on the opposite side of the kitchen, far enough away not to hear Aryan and Midian. Thank goodness. When everyone was nearly finished eating, Aldo joined the girls. Your father wanted me to talk to you, he said to Midian. It's about something serious. Of course it is. Midian shook her head and smiled. True to father's nature, he had delegated the serious conversation to Aldo. She almost chuckled. The twins, Aldo and Ezra, had practically raised her together. Father had always been lovable, warm and friendly, but very bashful. He struggled with holding deep, confiding conversations. What about Uberitas? She asked, taking a bite of her sandwich. Aldo raised his eyes. Oh, the usual. Midian cocked her head. Shopping? Since she was little, Aldo had been the one to take her to find cloth for her dresses. He didn't really enjoy it, but father enjoyed it even less. He hated being in public. So Aldo grudgingly helped. Kelson? She scowled. That's not the usual. Definitely not, Aryan said, especially since he'd just arrived. Well, the topic of men is a frequent one. The women nodded. So it was. Tell him I don't want to talk about Kelson. Not even with me? Aldo asked, a twinkle in his eye. Midian relented. She couldn't help it. Fine, fine. What do you want to know? Aldo sobered up. He thinks the two of you have enough in common to make a happy, pleasant couple. It didn't surprise her that father jumped to that conclusion. He was a matchmaker at heart. Maybe. If Kelson would grow up. Aryan's mouth popped open. Maybe? Maybe. Last night you hated him more than anyone. Midian raised her hands defensively. I didn't mean to say maybe. My focus was on the growing up part. I mean, he's attractive, but so very immature. Aldo grinned. I remember a certain 10-year-old girl once telling me that I was immature. Midian laughed. That's different. You're you. You'd never be cruel to me. Aldo smiled, placing his hand on hers. And neither would he, knowingly. I'm sure of it. He stood. Come, Let's show those boys all my amazing treasures." Not long after they got to Aldo's study, Midian decided she was glad she came. The response Dmitri and Kelson gave to Aldo's toys was worth it. "What is this box?" Kelson asked. "It's called a TV," Aldo said. "They're fabulous devices that allow you to watch performances and battles without being present." Kelson's eyes widened. "Wow! How does it work?" "It doesn't. Not right now, anyway. I still need a Macalo." "A what?" Kelson asked. "A Macalo," Ariane said. "They're magical creatures." She tilted her head. "Are you sure you're from Eclaron and not some other planet?" Kelson flushed and glanced away, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've never felt so uneducated in my life, honestly." Midian watched him with curiosity. The fact that he was embarrassed about not knowing something said a lot about his character. Many uneducated people she'd met didn't care that they were that way. They completely lacked the desire to improve their lives or learn more about the world around them. During the past several minutes, Kelson had shown that he had an unquenchable need to understand things. It melted Midian's frustration with him, but only a little. "Not uneducated," Aldo said. "Just controlled. Your former king excelled at forbidding his people to learn things and encountering people and creatures different from himself." Kelson nodded. He cleared his throat. "Anyway, as you were saying, you need a Macalo to do what? To come set up the TV with electricity. In fact, the entire castle needs to be set up. TVs are wonderful. You can watch other people live their lives on them." "Why would anyone want to do that?" Dmitri asked. Ariane laughed. "It's all pretend, and rather entertaining. We saw a presentation about people singing in bad weather once. It was funny. You'd love it." Dmitri put his arm around Ariane. "If you were there, of course I'd love it." Midian snuck a glance at Kelson. He was staring at her. "Have you seen the TV work before?" he asked her. Midian glanced away, wishing he wouldn't watch her like that. Those eyes really penetrated. "Yes, I have, many times." He smiled and moved away when Aldo indicated other things he'd found while travelling abroad: ancient weapons, vases, magical items, and many things that required electricity. Then Aldo noticed a clock on the wall. "Good gracious, it's bedtime, and I still haven't given the daily report to King Roylance." He followed the others out of his study and shut and locked the doors behind them. "You had all better rest while you can. The Duss's presence might not bode well." As they walked toward the living quarters of the castle, Kelson's hand brushed Midian's. She jumped, her heart speeding up. He pulled back. "Sorry." She didn't respond, unsure what to say. Why was she so jumpy? He hadn't even done it on purpose, and was he sorry he touched her, or sorry he'd startled her? While she was trying to fall asleep, Midian couldn't stop thinking about Kelson's excitement in Aldo's study. Yes, sometimes his exuberance was annoying, but the fact that he wanted to learn and improve himself just, well, it made her like him. A little. The next day, King Roylance invited everyone to spend time with him in the library, one of Midian's favourite places in the castle. The king used it as his private office and frequently entertained honoured guests or held important meetings there. As soon as the four were seated, King Roylance leaned forward on his desk, clasping his hands. "I feel as if we're treating you like children. I apologise for that. You are adults and really do have the freedom to go where you please, but for now, we must maintain your safety above your liberty." He cleared his throat. "Aldo informed me that Adust somehow gained access to the castle." He glanced at Midian. "I know how much you all enjoy the secret passageways, but please avoid them until we know for certain that no one is coming for Dmitri." He picked up a book, flipping open the pages. "That is all. Please, entertain yourselves as you'd like." Midian nodded, then slipped to the corner of the room where her easel and canvas were already set up. Kelson sank into one of the deep armchairs with a huge stack of books, smiling happily. Dmitri and Arian chose a couch for two near the king's desk and sat close to each other, shuffling through papers, probably planning the wedding. Midian sat in her chair, adjusting it so her back was to the corner and she could watch what was going on in the room. The canvas was tall enough that she felt safe, like no one could see her. Taking a deep breath, she picked up one of her favourite paintbrushes and chewed on the wooden end of it, staring at what she had created so far. It was a pencil sketch of a faraway city surrounded by trees. She was nearly ready to start adding colour, but couldn't decide which shade of green to make the leaves nearest the sun. She couldn't wait to start using the new paints Aldo had brought her. They were in tubes. Without her permission, her eyes strayed to Kelson. He looked so happy reading his books. The sun glowed on a section of his hair, making it appear even more golden than it was, and Midian forced herself back to her canvas. She ought to be ashamed of herself for how much she admired his hair. Finally choosing a pale yellow-green, Midian snatched up the tube and was about to open it when she felt someone watching her. She looked up. Kelson was staring at her from over his book. He held her eye. She couldn't look away. The expression on his face was serious, contemplative, as if he were trying to understand her. What was there to understand? Taking a deep breath, she finally returned her attention to her work, then realized she couldn't paint the trees until the sky was finished. She set the green tube down and picked up one of light blue. She heard a movement and sank lower behind the canvas. Kelson was making his way toward her. He plopped down in a chair on the other side of her easel. Great. He wanted to converse. "Read any good books lately?" he asked, thumbing through his own. "I don't enjoy reading." She didn't look at him. "You don't? How's that possible? Isn't your father one of the most well-read men in this kingdom?" "Yes." What could she say to make him leave her alone? "And that's the reason I don't like it." "Ah, what is..." She put down the tube, nearly dropping her paintbrush in the process. Her hands shook as she tucked a strand of hair away. Why did he have to know? Couldn't he go back to reading and stop flustering her? She tried to speak, realizing her dreadful attempt to say the horrible thing that threatened to come out. "He made me read every book in this library. Nearly every book anyway, and I tired of it. I prefer to learn through other ways. It was a fascinating lifestyle, and..." Kelson shook his head. "If I were forced to read that many books, maybe I'd understand." He leaned over. "What are you working on?" "Nothing. It's not finished." He stood up and came around the side of the easel. "This is amazing." Kelson glanced at the others in the room. "Have you all seen this? Look." Before Midian could stop him, he picked up the canvas and turned it to face everyone else. Dmitri applauded, King Roylance didn't turn from his papers, and Arian nodded, smiling at Kelson, then sent a glance of sympathy to Midian. Midian fisted her hands. "It's not finished. Please. Please, give it back." She grabbed the canvas from him. "Beware, I'm coming for yours." He frowned, looking at her in confusion. "But it's really good." She shook her head. "No, it's not. I haven't even really started it yet. I don't want people to see it." Kelson shrugged, returning to his deep armchair, and Midian slouched behind the canvas. She couldn't put two thoughts together. Everything was scattered in her brain. But one thought finally made its way to her consciousness. Was he trying to be cruel? After a few minutes, Midian couldn't concentrate. She couldn't be in the room anymore. She gathered her things and escaped out into the hall, hoping no one noticed her retreat. She leaned against the stone wall, eyes closed, and took a deep breath. "What's the matter?" Arian asked. Midian turned away and walked down the hall, not wanting to talk. Ayin followed. "I can tell he still upsets you." "You'd better be able to." "You're my best friend," Jay suggested. She shook her head. "I can't believe I ever thought he was attractive. He's a jerk, Arian." "No, he's just showing his interest." "By putting me on display like that?" Midian flung her hand in the direction of the library. "I didn't want everyone to see the canvas. It's not ready. And he likes you, Midian." She shook her head, folding her arms. "No, he doesn't. He wouldn't be so rude if he did." Oriane sighed in exasperation. "Okay, fine. You'll see." She took a breath and changed the subject. "I'm starving. Let's go find food." After dinner, Aldo asked Midian and Ariane to come to his study. Dmitri and Kelson were already there. Aldo steepled his fingers. "Kelson has decided he'll need a place to stay while he's here. Is this still correct, Kelson?" "Yes, and not in the castle. He thinks it would be more advantageous to live somewhere else in Gevkin." Aldo looked at Midian. "You know the kingdom better than anyone. Tell him about the various cities, then help him decide on a location." Midian cleared her throat, avoiding looking at Kelson. "Yes, uncle?" "Why was Kelson leaving the castle? Staying here was his original plan, wasn't it?" Then another thought crossed her mind. Aldo had asked her to spend time with Kelson. Her mouth went dry, and she nearly panicked, trying to swallow. She forced herself to think about the task. Gevkin wasn't exactly full of vacant houses. It wouldn't be easy to find a place for him. "When would you like me to start?" she asked Aldo, nearly whispering. Kelson and Dmitri had started a conversation, and she didn't want to be heard. "Oh, tomorrow sometime. It's too late now. Why don't you head upstairs? To bed." "Gladly." After tossing and turning for 3 hours, Midian finally gave up on trying to sleep. Her stomach rumbled, and she realized she'd never be able to get any rest unless she grabbed a snack. She slipped out of bed and padded across the cold stone floor, then crept down the hall. She was nearly to the kitchen when she realized it was already occupied. Voices echoed through the hallway, and not wanting to be seen in her robe, she jumped behind a tapestry. "We'd better turn in now," Kelson said. "I know." Dmitri paused, and Midian heard dishes clanking. "I've been meaning to ask you, how are things going where Midian is concerned? Have you spoken with her?" Kelson grunted. "Not really, and I probably won't ever. She obviously can't stand me." "What are you talking about?" "From what Arian said, she finds you very attractive." Midian put her hand over her mouth. "Ariane, how could she?" Kelson sighed. And she is beautiful. Regardless, it doesn't seem to matter what I do. She runs from me. She gets upset with me. I try to give her attention, to show her how I feel, but she spurns me," he grumbled. "And I don't even know why I try so hard. There's just something about her, something honest and refreshing, something that forces my eyes to find her all the time, to search her face for a clue about who she is and what she's thinking." Silence. Midian held her breath. "Have you considered what it is that she may want? Arian says she's shy. Painfully so. She might think you're being cruel by constantly putting her on the spot. If that's the case, she'll never consider you." Another silence. "I hadn't thought of that. It's just, well, this is how things always go, I know. She's different from the other girls you've chased, though, and something tells me that's a good thing." Kelson and Dmitri chuckled, and more dishes clattered. Midia didn't want to hear any more. Hunger forgotten, she rushed down the hallway back to her room, her bare feet softening her steps. Kelson was interested in her. He found her attractive. That hardly seemed possible. Her brown hair and eyes were so plain compared to his much lighter, more beautiful complexion. And in what way was she different from the girls Kelson chose? Just how many had he chased? Grinding her teeth, she jumped into bed, pulling the blanket to her chin. She refused to give another moment's thought to the conversation. It was time to sleep. And sleep she would. Of course, her body didn't respond to commands like that, and it took another hour for her to sink into oblivion. The next morning, Midian took her time preparing for the day. Her head ached from lack of sleep, and she still hadn't regained her appetite. Skipping breakfast, she headed straight to King Roylance's library, determined to follow Elder's instructions perfectly. It didn't take long for her to find maps of the cities surrounding Gevkan Castle. She began studying them, thinking about the local cultures and which place would be most suited for Kelson. Not long after she'd settled in, Dmitri, Arian, and Kelson arrived, laughing about something a servant had said. Ignoring them, Midian turned to another map and scrutinized the buildings on it, chewing the tip of her thumb. She knew that a couple of the buildings were vacant and available, but something told her Kelson would prefer living with other people. Kelson plopped into the chair next to hers. She cringed inwardly, expecting a conversation, but he didn't say anything. She took a deep breath. Better get it over with, and pulled the maps closer. "What type of place do you want to live in?" she asked. He shrugged. "I don't know. Why don't you tell me about the cities here?" She scrunched her forehead, thinking. Well, Maveril City's the popular choice, and for obvious reasons. It's nearest the castle, there are plenty of social events, and it's a wealthy city. He nodded. Sounds like a great place. Then there's Ridgewood. Though it's the next closest to the castle, the people there tend to be unfriendly and withdrawn. Kelson took the map and studied it. Not as great sounding. And there are places available in both cities? He set down the map. Are there other options? Yes, Makaria is on the opposite side of the lake. You might enjoy it there. The people are friendly and it's a very pretty city. The soil contains a great deal of salt, and therefore the entire place appears to be bleached white. He laughed. Don't need to buy salt if it's in the dirt around you. She wrinkled her nose. I wouldn't eat it if I were you. Oh, you don't need to worry, he said, patting her on the knee. I got out of my dirt-eating stage years ago. It took Midian a moment to recover from his touch. She allowed him a smile for the joke, then got back to business. In the other direction, there's a small village named Dats. I'd avoid it, though, since it's fairly close to Trews and all. Kelson took that particular map from her, then grabbed the rest, shuffling through them. What about Jocleur? She shrugged with one shoulder, tucking some hair behind her ear. How far from the castle do you want to go? Not too far. I want to be able to help Dmitri as needed. Then I recommend you stay here in Maveril City. You won't find a better place, for many reasons. Some of the finest tailors and entertainers are here. Where would you live, if given the choice? I wouldn't leave the castle. Kelson sighed. I'm afraid that's not an option. Midian met his gaze, surprised at the intensity, almost sadness, there. If he was attracted to her, why was he leaving? If I couldn't stay at the castle, I'd choose Maveril City. Then it settled. Kelson leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, hands behind his head. Midian watched him from the corner of her eye. She still couldn't help but wonder why he wanted to live elsewhere when there were plenty of perfectly good quarters here. He moved, and she started, glancing away. You know, growing up, I never envisioned myself living in Gevkin." "Oh?" Kelson chuckled. "Far from it. I couldn't see myself moving past the stables of Trews now." He looked at Midian. "That's how I met Dmitri, in fact. I'd been working there since I was 7. She nodded, not sure what sort of response he needed. It seemed to be adequate, though, because he continued talking. "When I was 8, I was approached by a man who claimed to be working against King Romantis." He clasped his hands. "No one liked the king, so when this man asked me to spy, I immediately accepted. Never told my parents about the arrangement." Midian tucked her legs under her and grabbed a soft wool blanket to hold. "What did you do?" "I mostly reported when the king was coming and going. If I ever heard names of people or locations he visited, I also passed that information along. It was easy work, and when I was a teenager, I started wanting more. I excelled at spying." He laughed. "Unfortunately, a member of the royal family decided to make me his favourite stable boy." "You're still my favourite," Dmitri called from across the room. Midian smiled. "I became very valuable to the group of people who were working against the king. They began training me to take over, to lead. But I also came to realise that I really enjoyed spending time with Dmitri. Despite our vast differences, we became fast friends." "Differences?" Midian asked. "Oh, you haven't heard?" Kelson asked, eyebrows raised. "Dmitri wasn't exactly the best person around." Midian nodded. "Yes, I know that. What other differences were there, though? They seemed so alike." "Then you know that Dmitri started turning his life around a few years ago." Kelson leaned forward and whispered. "It didn't hurt that he met Arian at that time. A guy will do practically anything for a pretty face and a sweet personality." Kelson didn't smile as he watched Midian, possibly trying to gauge her reaction to his words. Midian's heart thumped in her chest. She looked down at her hands, willing the heat not to enter her cheeks. Kelson continued. "I was there for him when he changed. We spent more and more time together, and he stopped looking at me as a stable boy or servant. Eventually, when I was comfortable with the idea, I introduced him to the man who'd hired me to spy on the king. And long story short, the man recognized an ideal opportunity and stepped out of the way for Dmitri's natural talent at leading people. I think. Because he was heir to the throne, followers listened to him over me or the other guy. They liked the idea that someone so powerful was turning traitor. It didn't take long for them to get to the point where they would have done anything for him." Kelson rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm a joker. Rarely serious. But Dmitri? He knows what people need. He knows how to incite rebellion. I'm not a leader, but Dmitri is. Even though I was originally trained to take over, it made sense that he would." "You were okay with that?" Midian blurted, then flushed, looking at her hands again. "Of course I was. As I said, he's a natural leader. I'm more of a show-off. He's far more influential than I'd ever be." He lowered his voice. "But don't be fooled. If he didn't have his right-hand man, he'd be lost." Kelson's eyes sparkled. Midian found herself smiling with him. His eyes were so bright. He leaned away, straightening himself. "I'm sorry. I must be boring you completely. I'm sure Ariane has already told you all this." She shook her head. "Oh no, it's refreshing hearing things from your point of view." She glanced down, then back up at him. "Please, continue. If that's what you really want." She nodded. "It is. All right, together we worked with the people, helping them overcome their frustration, directing it at the king. We stole his information, we organized attacks on him and his loyal subjects. We did everything we could to slow the spread of self-destruction and the evilness the king favored. At first we were successful. Things went well. He took a deep breath. But then the people started straying from us, a few at a time, then in large groups. They began fearing for their lives more than they feared captivity, and some even turned against us. His eyes got a faraway look in them. The last meeting we held was interrupted. The king's soldiers attacked, and Dmitri and I barely escaped. I only know of a few people who didn't die. Many disappeared and were never seen again. Midian couldn't imagine what it would be like to experience that. So much danger. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and Midian became acutely aware of the silence. It seemed to stretch on forever. Did he expect her to say something? If so, what? And how was she to know? He'd opened up to her, but he hadn't asked her any questions. She glanced sidelong at him. His eyes were shut, and he looked content. Good, he wasn't uncomfortable. She relaxed a little, allowing herself to examine him for a moment. His hair was darker here, away from the light. He seemed more relaxed, even given the circumstances. Abruptly, his eyes opened. This time, she refused to look away immediately. Her heart palpitated, and her hands started sweating. He searched her face, an expression of tenderness in his eyes. Her breath shortened. "Tell me about yourself," he asked. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. I want to understand who you are." Midian fidgeted with the blanket. "You have to ask questions. I can't just... I don't know what to say." "Well, tell me about your family. How you ended up here?" Midian relaxed into her chair. That wasn't a difficult topic. "My father, Ezra, brought my mother here after they were married. They were both older, and it took them many years to have a baby, me. Mother passed away not long after I was born. Father gets distracted sometimes, but King Roylance and Queen Ara Elise have treated me like a daughter." Kelson stretched his arms behind his head and looked up at the ceiling. "Do you plan to stay here for a while?" "Oh yes, for as long as I can." "I don't blame you. This castle is so wonderful compared to the one in Trusenol. The grounds are cared for, the servants are well fed, and the setting is so beautiful." He hesitated, then said quietly, "It's a place a man would love to call home." Midian's heart warmed, and she found herself wishing she had the courage to invite him to stay. "Then why are you leaving?" Kelson didn't answer. He seemed to recognize that she was warming to him, though, because he picked up one of her hands, cradling it in his. He rubbed the tips of her fingers with his thumb, then brought her hand to his lips. "Thank you for your help," he said, kissing her palm. This time, Midian didn't want him to stop. She didn't want to glare at him or scold him for his behavior. Her skin tingled everywhere he touched her, causing goosebumps to rise. Kelson gently laid her hand back in her lap, gave her a grin that showed dimples, then stood and stretched. Just then, Aldo rushed into the room. "Scouts have received word that a messenger is on their way from Trusenol. Everyone to the throne room." Wanting to curse the interruption, Midian jumped to her feet and wobbled. The blood rushed back into her toes, making them tingle. Kelson steadied her. Then they dashed out of the library, following Dmitri and Ariane. When they arrived in the throne room, King Roylance leaned forward in his chair, gripping the armrest. "Ekin just sent a minya," he said. "A messenger was on his way to the castle when he was struck by an arrow. He only made it as far as the town hall. He was chased there, and Ekin barely got him inside before they were overrun by horsemen. The man told Ekin that the message he carried was only for someone trusted, no servants. He died shortly after arriving, and Ekin is unwilling to leave Maveril City or even his town hall." The king wiped his brow. "I can't go, the queen can't go, and I refuse to send my daughter or her intended." Dmitri stepped forward. Your Majesty, reconsider, and send me. I can get there and back in just a few minutes on my horse." King Roylance shook his head. "No. Anyone who delivers the message must do so on foot, through the forest. Horses can't penetrate most sections there, and it'll be safest." Midian frowned. The forest might be safest from human attacks, but it was dangerous in other ways. The king continued. "Dmitri, I'm sorry, but you must stay with your betrothed. I need to protect the future of my family and kingdom." He looked at Kelson. "Would you be comfortable doing this?" Kelson nodded. "Yes, of course, but I've never been in the forest here and have only passed through town once on my way to the castle. I'll need a guide, perhaps one of the servants." The king shook his head. "They can't be trusted. Even the most loyal let their tongues slip occasionally. If the message is as important as Ekin stressed, we can't allow servants to deliver it." He put his head in his hand. "Midian, I'm sorry to ask this of you, but it is you who must guide Kelson. Aldo or Ezra would be noticed too easily, and you spend a great deal of time in the forest. Plus, you know Maveril City better than people born there." Midian nodded. "When would you have us leave?" She suspected she already knew the answer, but needed to ask anyway. "Immediately." She nodded again, then turned and rushed from the room, Kelson on her heels. "What do we do?" Kelson asked, running alongside her. "We must wear dark clothes, black, purple or blue. I have access to plenty." Midian raced through the castle to the supply room that held many different varieties of cloaks. She and Kelson each picked one, then pulled them on over their clothing. Aldo found them, carrying flashlights. "Here, I've put in new batteries. They'll last the whole time you're gone." Midian took the brown one and Kelson the green. They switched them on and off again, verifying that they indeed did work, then bade Aldo goodbye. Midian led Kelson through the castle to the servants' entrance. She motioned for him to be silent and hide his flashlight. Hoods up, they exited the castle, passing a few other cloaked servants. They crunched across the courtyard, past the stables and under the huge arch. Looking back to make sure no one was watching, they crept into the forest. When they'd walked for several minutes, Midian pulled out her flashlight and turned it on. "We'll be fine to use them now. Hardly anyone enters or exits the forest at night." "Why is that?" "It's unsafe. There are dangerous creatures here, and many areas where brambles prevent you from continuing onward." Kelson frowned. "But you know your way?" She nodded. "I grew up here. I'm always in the forest. Arian grew up here too, didn't she? Does she spend a lot of time here?" "No, she prefers the castle. Never has been one for adventuring." They fell silent, and nothing but the crunch of dried leaves and twigs beneath their feet reached their ears. Kelson grabbed her hand, squeezing her fingers. She glanced up at him. He looked at her, not smiling, and Midian dropped her eyes. She didn't let go, though. The warmth of his hand seeped through her glove, causing tingles to race up her arm. She wanted to ask him what he'd been about to say back in the castle, but found she couldn't form the words. The lights of Maveril City soon twinkled ahead, but instead of entering the city, Midian led Kelson to the left, in a long arc around the town. At a questioning glance from Kelson, Midian put her finger to her lips. He didn't realize it, but Maveril City had a very active nightlife. The moment they were seen together, alone, exiting the forest, scads of gossip would be spread, which would alert any enemies to their presence almost immediately. Pretty soon, the town hall came into view. Looking both ways, making sure there were no people, Midian dashed across the short-cut grass and rapped on the back door. Ekin opened up, ushering them inside. He gestured to a body lying on the floor in the kitchen. "I'm not sure what to do about it yet," he whispered. "Too many people will ask questions." Midian caught his intent. "I'll let the king know. He can send instructions later." Ekin nodded and handed over a scroll. Hurry, there's danger in the air. I haven't seen the horsemen that attacked him in 10 minutes, but they're out there, in the city. Midian tucked the scroll away and pulled her cloak tighter around her. Ekan opened the door and Midian and Kelson left, racing across the grass and back into the forest. Right after they entered, Kelson got caught in brambles. Midian flustered as she pulled him loose, aware of his breath on her neck. Once he was freed, they continued, but only minutes later. A roar sounded not far away. Midian met eyes with Kelson. Her breath got stuck in her lungs. A rog was coming. "Died," she whispered. Kelson peered forward, then grumbled. "No." He picked her up and helped her onto a tree branch. She pulled herself up higher, then reached down for him. "Kelson, hurry!" But it was too late. The bear-like creature rushed toward them, jaw gaping, moonlight glinting off long front teeth. Midian looked at Kelson. What was he doing? He had to hide. The rog would kill him, but he seemed unperturbed. He pulled a long knife from a sheath on his thigh. "No, Kelson, please," she whispered. Her plea was drowned out by the roar of the beast. The rog rushed Kelson, who stepped to the side, avoiding the tackle. The rog spun. Kelson turned to meet it. This time he flung his knife at the creature. It buried deep in the beast's chest. Kelson pulled out his sword and finished off the monster. Midian's jaw dropped. She froze in the tree. There was no way a single man could kill a rog. They were bigger than bears. And yes, they had human hands, but their massive strength made up for the lack of claws. How did he kill it so quickly? Kelson calmly wiped off his sword and resheathed it. Then he pulled his knife from the rog's chest and cleaned it as well. He walked over to the tree and reached for her. Midian lowered herself, and he held her in a warm embrace. "You're shivering," he said, not letting go. She didn't respond. "Are you cold? Scared?" Again, she didn't say anything. Finally, after a few minutes, she said, "You killed a rog." He released her, then took her hand. "We have those everywhere on the outskirts of Truzenol," he said. "It's not the first time I've had to slay one. In fact, I believe that was the 6th I've killed." He squeezed her fingers. "Come, let's hurry." They raced through the forest, Midian leading the way, cradling the message to her chest with the hand he wasn't holding. They entered the castle, then dashed to the throne room, the doors banging behind them. Dmitri, Aryan and the king looked up in surprise. Aldo continued reading, not seeming to have noticed them enter. Midian gave the message to the king. He unrolled it and read, eyes widening. He glanced up at Aryan, then back to the message. Then he wound up the parchment and looked at Dmitri. "Do you know a man named Beckett?" Dmitri frowned. "Yes, I do. He's my father's head butler. He wrote this. He was the messenger who died." Dmitri rubbed his chin, a troubled expression on his face. "I had no idea. I never knew he was helping my cause. What does it say?" "That Romantis, your father, wants—" The king's voice cracked. "He's coming right now. For Aryan. Beckett says Romantis is threatening to exchange a child for a child, you for my daughter." The king motioned to Aryan. "We must protect her." Aryan approached him. "I'll be fine, father. You have many guards and soldiers. Romantis could never break in." King Roylance shook his head. "No, we must not become complacent. The dust got in somehow. We will hide you, protect you." He motioned to the group. "We will hide all of you." Just then, the doors flung open, and a soldier dashed inside, grinning. "We killed the men on horseback." Midian released a breath, hand on her chest. The others visibly relaxed as well, but the king rose to his feet. "All of them? Are you sure?" The soldier faltered. "We only saw 5. We only heard reports of 5. "Uh-huh." The king thanked and dismissed the man, then motioned Dmitri and the others near. "Midian, there's a small wardrobe on the 3rd level of the castle, near the red and blue tapestry. Do you know which one I mean?" Midian nodded. The wardrobe had been her favourite place to go with sketching paper as a teenager. "It'll only hold 2. Take Arian and Dmitri there, then hide yourself and Kelson somewhere else in the castle." The king looked up. "Despite the good news from the soldier, I believe the danger of the night is far from over." "What about you, father?" Arian asked. The king brushed off Arian's question. "It's not me he wants. Hurry. Go now." Midian grabbed Arian's arm and pulled her toward the doors. Dmitri and Kelson followed. The 4 ran through the halls of the castle, going up a set of stairs and through several corridors, then up another set. "Help me," Midian said, trying to push aside a small armoire. Kelson and Dmitri jumped to assist, and the armoire slid away from the wall, revealing a plain sheet of wood. Midian hit a corner of it, and the panel popped open. She jumped when someone screamed from around the corner. Midian's breath stopped in her throat. "Quickly, quickly," she whispered. Arian ducked inside. The door was no more than 4 feet tall. She was followed by Dmitri, who turned back. "How do we get out?" "There's a lever inside." Dmitri nodded and pulled the panel shut. Kelson and Midian pushed the armoire back into place. "Will they be able to move the armoire from the other side?" Kelson whispered. "Think so." Midian took his hand and led him down the corridor, away from whoever had screamed. "Where are we going?" Kelson whispered. "I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of something." There were plenty of places to hide in the castle, but most of them were far away. There had to be something. She gasped. She knew of one. Another hidden door that led to a set of stairs down to a tunnel. It was back the way they'd come. Midian turned, but something stopped her. Grabbed her arm. She froze, looking into strange bloodshot eyes veiled under a dark hood. Kelson also turned. "Where are?" His eyes widened as he saw the man. "King Romantis." Then Kelson jerked forward, collapsing to the stone floor, and remained down. Another hooded man stood there, holding a heavy vase. Midian screamed, and King Romantis shoved a large piece of cloth in her mouth. Then he turned to the man with the vase. "Het, take care of the princess," he said. "The princess?" "Yes, father." Ket dropped the vase and grabbed Midian, yanking her closer to him, and she realized they thought she was Arian. He tied more cloth around her head, holding the gag in place. She struggled, pounding the man's chest, scratching at his face. Het's hood fell back, revealing dark eyes and even darker hair. Dmitri? No, but similar. His brother. How did they get in the castle, and so fast? "Let's go," King Romantis said. Et picked up Midian and slung her over his shoulder. Keeping to the shadows, the 2 men crept through the castle. Midian tried screaming through her gag, but stopped when Het slammed her against the wall, dazing her. She couldn't let them do this. She had to keep her thoughts and wits about her, watching for an opportunity to escape. The men dashed through the castle doors. At least 10 men in dark clothes waited with horses just outside the large arch. Het tucked Midian's arms to her sides, then threw her onto a horse in front of a man with so much facial hair she couldn't see his eyes. "Treat her gently," King Romantis said. "It wouldn't do to have her harmed. I have got plans for her." The men laughed and Midian's inside squirmed. "Please, someone see, someone come." With a flick of the reins, the man urged the horse onward. The group galloped away, following the cobblestone road. The wind roared in Midian's ears, and her hair whipped the man in the face. He didn't seem to notice or care. Only a few minutes later, castle bells started chiming, and fires were lit on top of the parapets and watchtowers. Midian heard Romantis's cackle over the rushing wind. "They've discovered she's missing," he said. The men urged the horses to go faster. Midian held on tightly, wondering what Romantis would do if she jumped. Would she survive a fall like that? She paid attention to the path they were taking, wondering why they headed toward Ridgewood and Macaria instead of Trusinell. What were King Romantis's plans? Soon they rounded a corner and rode along the shores of Sonder Lake, the forest to the left of them. Romantis looked over his shoulder at her, then grinned as he watched something behind them. "They're in pursuit." The men urged their horses even faster, and Midian tried to control the panic rising in her chest. She couldn't take in big enough breaths. She tried to push the gag out of her mouth with her tongue. It didn't work. Then she realized something. They hadn't tied her hands. She reached up and yanked the gag out of her mouth, gulping in the air she craved. The man behind her didn't notice. They neared a cabin that belonged to a friend of Arian's. Suddenly, a man jumped out of the forest and ran down the hill toward them, banging on the walls of the cabin as he passed it. The horse that Midian was on skittered to the side, nearly throwing her. She held on, screaming at the man for help, watching as more men poured from the forest. One of them looked like Kelson. Was he okay? The cabin's doors opened, and a huge woman stepped out. She threw something into the air, a powder that settled over everyone and everything. Midian's horse sneezed, then bucked. Midian did her best to hold on, but she and the bearded man were thrown off. She fell into a clump of bushes and nearly blacked out from the impact. Seconds later, another horse reared up above her, and she was forced to roll over and away. She barely missed being trampled. Swords were clanging, men crying out in pain. Someone fell into the bush by her. It was Het, King Romantis' son. He stumbled to his knees, leering at her. Midian squirmed back and kicked him in the face as hard as she could. Het roared, lunging at her. He grabbed her hair and yanked her closer, then peered into her eyes as she struggled. "Father," Het dragged her to her feet. "It's not the princess. This one has brown eyes." Romantis cursed. "Then where is she?" "Still at the castle," Kelson said, shoving a man away from himself. Where did he come from? "And you should not have stolen Midian." "I have no use for a servant," Romantis said. "Men, to your horses. We leave at once." Het dropped Midian, and he and several others rushed to their horses and mounted. Romantis rode toward Kelson and whipped out his sword, striking Kelson as he passed. Midian screamed, watching Kelson fall into a bush. She raced to his side, oblivious to the men who charged after Romantis's group. Kelson's eyes fluttered open. He was a mess. Blood caked to the side of his face. Midian. "Shush," she said, checking for other wounds. "Closer." "Hold me if I..." Kelson coughed, his eyes rolling back. "No, Kelson, stay with me." Midian's voice caught in her throat. She cradled his head in her lap, using her skirt to brush the blood away from his face. "Please, don't go." She frowned when the blood crumbled away. It didn't act like blood. Then Midian noticed that Kelson's hand held a big wad of the stuff. Kelson took a shuddering breath, then went still. One of his eyes peeked open. "Ah, you're still not close enough," he whispered, then coughed again. The pain. It's so dreadful. I need a woman to salve it. I need Midian." Midian glared. "Oh, you." She swatted his shoulder. "You put mud on your face." "Actually, I fell into it and tried to wipe it off before you came. Then I realized I could use it to my advantage." Kelson smiled up at her, his eyes softening as she continued brushing mud from his cheeks. Midian felt her heart swell and butterflies flutter in her stomach. She was grateful for the darkness that made her expression difficult to see. "Midian," Kelson whispered, "look at me." "I am." She continued, wiping mud away. "No, look at me." Kelson reached up and grabbed her hand, stilling it, and she had nothing to do but look into his eyes. "I need to say this before we're distracted again." He took a breath. "Midian, you are beautiful, inside and out, and I'll spend as much time as necessary for you to feel comfortable around me. I'm moving away from the castle for you, to give you space, to get out of your hair so I can court you properly." Midian's mouth opened. Court her? How did she feel about this? She didn't know. He'd been so difficult when he first came. But understanding now that he wasn't trying to be cruel, that he'd been trying to get to know her, she was more willing to give him a chance. "There's plenty of room in the castle," she whispered. A smile crossed Kelson's face, and he started to sit up. "So, I can stay?" "Of course you can." Midian gasped when she saw real blood on the back of his head. "You are wounded. You need to get back to the castle." "I know. Dmitri would miss me if anything happened." Midian looked away. "I don't think he's the only one. Are you saying you would miss me too?" Unable to meet his gaze, Midian looked down, noticing for the first time that their hands were entwined. Kelson glanced down as well, then let go with one hand, raising it to rest on her cheek. Their eyes locked. This time Midian didn't turn away. She searched his face, his expression, waiting to see if he was teasing or mocking her. His eyes were clear as he searched hers as well. Midian felt her heart swell when she sensed his honesty and good intentions. He truly wished to know her. Her barriers and shyness slipped away, and she brushed his cheek with the back of her free hand. Kelson captured it, holding it against his face, then pulled her closer to him, his eyes straying to her lips. Was he about to kiss her? Just then, Dmitri rounded the bush, and Midian jerked away. "Oh, good. You found her. You're both safe." "Yes, Dmitri, we are," Kelson said, clearly exasperated. "They got away. Well, the ones who didn't die, anyway." Dmitri rubbed his face. "Midian, you're a wonderful woman, so don't take this wrong. But what did they want with you, anyway? They thought I was Zarian." She turned to Kelson. "How did you get here so fast?" "Arian showed us a tunnel," he said, pointing over his shoulder. Midian nodded. "Oh yes, it belongs to the fat lady. We haven't used it in years." Kelson choked. "What did you call her?" The fat lady?" "Uh-huh. You're brave." "I'd never dare call a woman something like that." Midian laughed. "It's her name. She refuses to let us call her by anything else." Dmitri turned to her. "Would you send for Minya? We need to have the castle guards gather these men, bury the dead, and throw the rest in the dungeon." "What about your father?" Dmitri glowered. "We'll deal with him later." Kelson was more injured than he'd let on. A huge goose egg grew on the back of his head where Het had struck him, and a bruise blossomed down his arm from when Ramantus had taken a swipe at him with the blunt edge of his sword. But nothing would have kept him from finding Midian, as he told her on the way home. "I've made an arrangement with Ramantus," King Roylance announced at dinner that evening. "He's agreed to leave you in peace, Dmitri, in exchange for a very large sum of money." Dmitri shook his head. "I'm surprised he's settled at all." "And you can't pay it. It's not right to submit to the will of a terrorist." "Yes, I can. If it means the happiness of my children, it's worth it, and no amount of money can equal the worth of a soul. One day, your father may come to realize this." The next couple of weeks went by in a blur as King Romantis sent Dmitri's things and received his money. Almost all of Midian's time was spent helping Arian finish planning the wedding. Much time passed wherein she didn't see or hear from Kelson. She began to wonder if she'd misunderstood his intentions, but was that possible? Had he misjudged his feelings in the rush of the moment? A month after the attack on the castle, Midian threw off her covers, unable to fight her thoughts for yet another night. She thrust her feet into her slippers and yanked on a robe, then left Arian sleeping alone in the room. The last several nights, Midian had found peace by going to the observatory at the top of the highest tower in the castle. She would look up at the stars and finally allow herself to feel and to wonder and to wish for things that might never be hers. But tonight, someone was already there. A hooded figure, hunched in the darkness. Midian gasped. Was she about to be captured again? Had Romantis gone back on his promise? Would anyone hear her? Midian, Kelson said, turning to look at her and lowering his hood. I was hoping to find you here. Aldo says you come often. Midian's heart fluttered in her neck as she tried to catch her breath. I thought you were Romantis. You frightened me. Kelson hesitated, watching her carefully, then seemed to make a decision and pulled her into his arms. I'm sorry. He kissed her forehead, then tilted her face so he could see her. We have unfinished business, you know. Warmth pushed outward from Midian's heart, threatening to choke her as tears prickled her eyes. I thought you'd forgotten, I whispered, and I thought you were avoiding me. Arian has needed a lot of help lately, as has Dmitri. They chuckled together, then Kelson brushed a lock of hair behind her ear. I'm sorry about all of that, he whispered, his eyes not leaving hers. You too, she said, her head throbbing. She nodded, finding it hard to look away. He watched her for several moments, a question on his face, then lowered his head until their lips met. Midian didn't know what to expect. She'd never kissed anyone before. At first, the contact felt weird, strange, and she couldn't respond. But her inaction seemed to cause him to hesitate, and she sensed that he was about to pull back. No, she whispered, wrapping her arms around him, holding him to her. Kelson responded by kissing her with urgency. Her cheeks, her jaw, then back to her lips. Midian melted in his embrace, savouring the happy emotions that rushed over her. A few moments later, Kelson sighed and rested his chin on top of her head. I never want to leave you again, not even for a few minutes. Midian breathed deeply, feeling his heart beating near her cheek. I'm perfectly fine with that. Truly, you know I'll still tease you. A grin coloured his voice. And you know I'll still be shy. I really hope so. It's endearing. Especially now that I know you don't hate me. Midian fingered a thread on his shirt, finding it hard to look up again. I definitely don't hate you, she whispered. Far from it. Kelson rubbed her back, causing her skin to tingle. And I shall do everything in my power to win you over, not just today, but forever. She glanced up then. You promise? I promise. She smiled and reached her arms around his neck as he placed his lips on hers again. She relaxed into the kiss, knowing that right here was where she belonged. The end. You've been listening to Midian, a Kilenya Romance by Andrea Pearson.